Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. Let me start by saying a happy International Day of Democracy to everybody. We've decided to do this webinar, which is organized by the United Nations Development Programme and the Finnish chapter of the UN Association. My name is YK-liitto. I'm the lab manager at the UN Technology and Innovation Lab based in Finland. And my caveat is that this is the first time that I'm moderating an online webinar, so please excuse my excuses for any glitches or gremlins in the system. Let me just set out why we're here today, and then I'll just quickly introduce the panelists. The COVID situation has resulted in major social, political, and economic challenges globally. The UN Secretary General has urged governments to be transparent, responsive, and accountable in their COVID response and in their recovery plans, while respecting human rights and the rule of law. The reason we're here today is we wanted to discuss how the COVID crisis has impacted the state of democracy. And what we want to explore are some of the ways forward towards just and democratic societies even after the pandemic. I just wanted to go through a few logistical notes before I introduce the panelists. So firstly, this webinar will be recorded on both Zoom and on YouTube. We will share the link on YouTube, so anyone who wants to view the webinar later can do that. Our panelists have their video on, and it's only the panelists and the moderator who has their videos on. Everyone else is muted through the webinar. But through the panel, we will be posting some polls that allow participants to interact with the panelists. We'll discuss the results of those polls. So hopefully there is some kind of the way that you can take part. So let me first introduce the panelists. We've got a really wonderful group of people here today for you. So the first person I'd like to introduce is Sara Sofia Siren. She is the chair of the UN Association, and she's also a member of parliament in Finland for the National Coalition Party. Sara Sofia, welcome. Very, very good to have you with us. And I want to also introduce Maria Soco, who is the UNDP head, the UNDP resident representative in Kosovo. So it's very good to see you, Maria, and welcome. Maria is dialing in from Kosovo. I also want to introduce Itonde Kakoma, who is the Director of Global Strategy at the Crisis Management Institute in Finland. Itonde, welcome, and good to see you again. And then we have Anu Juvonen, the executive director of Demo Finland. Welcome, Anu. We haven't met, but a very warm welcome to you. And Yuri Birjulin, who is, I'm very proud to say, our youth delegate. So he's the UN youth delegate for Finland. A very warm welcome, Yuri. So I'm going to go through some questions. We'll have the poll and we'll go back to the questions. And then in the middle of the webinar, we've got a really important message from Sarah Lister, who's the head of democracy at the United Nations Development Programme. Sarah's can't participate today, but she sent us a video. And the video is really interesting because it sets out some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. But let's start with a first question to Anu. Anu, it's very clear that democracy is being challenged by COVID. But some people say that democracy was already in decline before COVID. I wanted to ask, Anu, what challenges are you facing in your work? And in terms of the development of democracies, both before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And actually, Anu, could you just introduce yourself before you answer the question and say a little bit about your organization, and then we can go back to the question. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Rasi. Thanks for inviting on this very crucial and important panel. My name is Anu, and I'm running the secretary of the Demo Finland, Political Parties of Finland for Democracy. We are ourselves an example of multi-party cooperation. We have all the nine political parties of the Finnish parliament on board, and we support international democracy support. We're not exporting democracy, we are supporting it, especially through enhancing the rights of the underrepresented groups in politics, youth and women, through our schools of politics, Tunisia, Myanmar, parliamentary oversight in Mozambique, and also we do work in Finland with the parties. And back to your question, Rasi, that is a very important question. We see a lot of data about the decline of democracy and the rise of autocracies recently, and indeed COVID pandemic has strengthened the trend of democracy deficit. There's been a lot of emergency legislation in place in numerous countries, and there is a fear that those will become permanent features. So we need to be vigorous. The international community, member states, civil society. Our work in Demo Finland, we always work with local actors, with their think tanks, women's organizations and such like, and many of them have been able to be agile in their work and do a digital leap. However, in some countries, like in Ethiopia, it's been a bit trickier. The government closed the internet down for 3 weeks. So digital leap was made impossible through that way. Plus, then the lack of access to internet-based services is also another question. So we see these kind of trends, the misuse of digital sphere in order to restrict the rights. Another example, which I think is very unfortunately good example of a democracy deficit during the time of COVID is Sri Lanka, where we support the multi-party cooperation between the women's organizations as well as previously, especially on the youth cross-party. The government didn't enjoy any oversight from the parliament. The parliament was dissolved for 3-4 months before the elections, and there's been a lot of raised concerns about the lack of freedom of expression. Unfortunately, the outcome of the election early August shows that the number of women in the parliament is still extremely low, 5.5%, which is even internationally very low, as well as the rise of authoritarianism. So there are certain trends that we're trying to tackle through multi-party dialogue, through sharing good practices from the Finnish part, as well as cross-horizontally. So I think these are the key issues that I wanted to raise at this point.
Thank you, Anu. It's interesting what you say. I didn't realize the full extent of the impacts of COVID on the democratic space. Our office deals with the digital space, and it's very concerning how the digital space is being used to undermine democracy beyond pre-COVID and during COVID. But it's very interesting what you say in terms of the extent and breadth of ramifications. Thank you, Anu. I'm going to go to Atonde. Just coming, actually, Anu mentioned it a little bit about some of the countries that she mentioned when she was giving her answer. So we know that COVID has been compared to a natural disaster, and natural disasters change countries radically, sometimes for the best, but also sometimes for less so. Now, this pandemic may not fit into a definition, a classical definition of a natural disaster, but the consequences of the crisis are very similar, and Anu touched on some of those. So increasing poverty, food shortages, access to education. So Itonde, I wanted to ask you, from CMI's work, can you tell us how COVID has impacted democracy in fragile states? And perhaps you could say something about yourself and CMI before you do pose your answer.
Thank you, Razin, and really thank you for convening this discussion on such an important day marking democracy. And firstly, I work at the Crisis Management Initiative. We are celebrating 20 years of existence. It was founded by Finland's former president and Nobel Peace Laureate, Martti Ahtisaari. And our raison d'etre, our focus is on the advancement of the peaceful settlement to violent and political conflicts. So the questions that you raise and the points that Anu put forward with regards to a deficit in democracy, that trend underway, are very much part and parcel of our thinking. Now, let me start with the opportunity as you framed it, and the comparison that you drew to a global pandemic and a natural disaster. Now, as an institution, and through the leadership of our founder, President Ahtisaari, following one of the more profound of many natural disasters to hit Southeast Asia, the tsunami, a historic peace agreement was struck in Aceh of Indonesia. And there are many lessons to be drawn there. And in fact, our Asia team has reflected on this quite recently in light of the global pandemic we face today. And you put your finger on it, Razi. At certain times, collective crises, and that's what we're facing as a global family, collective crises create an environment in line with the Secretary General, the UN's call for a global ceasefire, but they create an environment whereby a collective response might be achieved. That is, even in the face of great adversity or because of it, and even amidst significant, be it ideological, political, or ethno-military strife, a collective crisis can bring about the environment for what's good for the whole. And this is what leads, in addition to the astute leadership from the region and our founder, to the Aceh Peace Agreement. Now, your colleagues from UN would know better, but I think the challenge facing the global pandemic as we speak, with regards to fragile states and the peaceful resolution to political or even armed conflicts, is despite the collective crisis we face as a human community, there has lacked the collective resolve, not only with regards to the responses in place. So instead of the multilateral spirit of nations, even in particular regions, to put forward coherent and collective policies, there was a sliding back, not only in terms of the deficit in democracy, but also a sliding back from multilateral principles. Deep irony in this, given that we're all facing it together. So if there was ever an opportunity for a collective response to a globally faced challenge, it would be now. Clearly, what this current crisis has exposed also is that fragile states, not solely from an economic point of view, and that is critical, but what we've seen is that it's not just about how wealthy a nation is in facing this. All walks of life have been impacted, including the most wealthy of nations on the planet. It has exposed the question of resilience and the way in which not simply development or money plays its part, but something UNDP has lifted up for many years: good governance, delivery of basic services as being part and parcel of whether a vastly developed state can persevere or an extremely fragile state can have the resilience to carry on in the face of a natural disaster or a global pandemic. And that puts squarely on the table how basic delivery of services becomes a driving concern of all members of society, regardless of rank. I can say more, but perhaps we continue the discussion, Razi.
No, thank you, Tunde. You've opened up a very, very interesting area of discussion. I completely agree on the governance issue. I have to say that the World Health Organization is leading the vanguard of the kind of the collective response, the collective health response on parts of the UN and the nations, and it's really important. that countries kind of follow the WHO advice and feed back information back to WHO. But that is happening, and I think that's a good example of a good collective response. We're going to go to the first poll question. I'm just going to give you some background, and then the poll question will actually pop up on your screens. All the audience will have the opportunity to agree or disagree with the question, and then you can press submit. And then we'll have a quick discussion about the response from the audience. So the first poll question is really about the civic space and civic society. So in some countries, the civic space was shrinking before the pandemic. Anu, you alluded to it in your response around kind of the shrinking democratic space. Examples include the postponement of elections, constraints on movement, constraints on gatherings, and access to information are affecting the ability of societies to function effectively. Now, the question is COVID-19 and response measures are contributing to shrinking the civic space. So COVID-19 response measures also contribute to shrinking the civic space. Do you agree or disagree? If you can choose one and then press submit, be very good to gauge what the audience perceives and thinks about this issue. We should have the, yes, okay, so we've got 88% agree. So Anu and Anton, there's verification right there for you in terms of perceptions, but also from people's experiences, I'm sure, from the audience. I'm gonna just hold that one for now, and I'm just gonna quickly just move on, and we may come back to discussing that, the civic space, but I think it will come out in some of these questions as well. But I'm gonna go to Maria. Maria, UNDP has been a big partner. I used to work for UNDP. I really enjoyed my time at UNDP. So if you could say something about UNDP. I know Sarah will say something in her video, but just introduce yourselves and they say something about UNDP's work. The Kosovo work we'll come back to later, but the question for you, so Kosovo is one of the youngest states in Europe, declared its independence in 2008. Despite many developments, many positive developments, there are still issues such as corruption, high youth unemployment, and some political turmoil. Now, consolidating democracy is a process, and a crisis like the pandemic can halt or even reverse this process. Can you just give us a quick overview, some kind of the salient points of how COVID has impacted the democracy work in Kosovo?
Thank you, Razi, and happy International Day of Democracy to everyone. Very happy to be part of this panel. Yes, my name is Maria Soco. I'm the resident representative in UNDP Kosovo. UNDP is a global development organization, the development arm of the UN, if we say. We operate in 170 countries, so basically all around the world. The ultimate purpose, of course, is the eradication of poverty in all its forms, but also reduction of inequalities, exclusion, very much supporting the governments, the countries to develop themselves, both in terms of their policies, strategies, their structural reforms, and most importantly, particularly in the COVID context, in building their resilience to shocks. So it's a very kind of a broad mandate we have. In Kosovo, UNDP, we've been operational for 20 years. So the same as with a colleague from CMI. And I've been here for about a year, and it's definitely been an interesting year. So let me first just give a bit of background of the COVID situation here. The pandemic was announced in mid-March when the first cases of COVID were confirmed. 2 days later, the government declared a public health emergency, not the state of emergency, but health emergency. and restrictive measures were introduced soon after, including limitations to movement and economic activities. So a lot of businesses were closed, particularly the smaller ones. Schools and universities went online. Staff in public and private offices were reduced to bare minimum. And also us at the UN Kosovo team, we moved to working from home modality, which we have actually continued today. And in early June, the restrictions were largely lifted. Like in many other parts of the world, the number of infections started increasing. The peak of the daily cases was reached at the end of July. Now we're kind of in a better period, but to date, we've had 14,650 positive cases confirmed, and 590 people have died. And the total population of Kosovo is about 1.8 million. In Kosovo, the pandemic has showed, on one hand, the agility of Kosovo society and institutions to adapt to an unprecedented crisis. And on the other hand, it's exposed weaknesses in the systems, as well as individuals' abilities to adapt to new ways of working and living. I'd say that given the weaknesses in digital architecture and processes, the delivery of public services has proven to be challenging. So going back to the point raised earlier. At the end of March, we, as UNDP, we conducted a public pulse survey, which is something we do have been doing regularly for the past 10 years. It's a perception study that kind of looks into many aspects of life. And this particular, one of the questions in this survey was whether people were satisfied with the performance of the institutions, and particularly in the COVID response. And at that time of the epidemic, 79% of respondents had a positive view on the measures that were introduced. However, the situation has quite radically changed ever since, as the crisis has prolonged and unfolded, and the economic consequences are becoming clearer. And really, this is the crisis is affecting an increasing number of people in many ways. It's really become clear that more needs to be done to allow for new ways of working and for delivering of public services, particularly when it comes to providing access to justice for all, good quality and timely health and social services, education and livelihoods. We've also seen in Kosovo how the political developments can affect the way the institutions are able to effectively focus on dealing with the crisis. We've also seen what a critical role a strong and effective inter-ministerial or institutional coordination and communication play, and how it's important it is to have effective digital solutions to allow for this to happen. And strong IT and effective digital solutions are really critical also to maintain the communication with the public in ensuring transparency and also providing reliable information. And not only for this, not only to inform people about how to protect themselves, but really to also maintain the confidence of people that they're being looked after. We're seeing many challenges in all these areas, but at the same time, we've also seen how good coordination among the development partners has really provided valuable support to Kosovo authorities as they're managing the crisis. And this has really allowed for effective and timely response, particularly in terms of providing the most critical support that is directly impacting people's health and lives. So that would be my first.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. We're going to come on to some of the responses as well. But one thing I just wrote down while you were talking is leadership in crises, and it's really this. The COVID it's forming cracks in lots of areas, in terms of gender, in terms of kind of responses or democracy, but also in terms of leadership. And it does expose the cracks in leadership, and we're seeing some of that. Itonde, I'm very sorry. I think I said institute, not initiative. So I apologize for not getting your name correct. I should know better. And the other thing I wanted to say was that some of you cannot see the poll result. So if the poll result did not flash up on your screen, 88% of the people who participated agreed that the pandemic is shrinking the civic space. So I'll actually just alert you of what the poll results are. We're going to go to Sarah, Sophia, and then we're going to go to Yuri, and a couple of questions for you both. So Sarah, Sophia, when we just talk about democracy, we focus on countries that are perhaps kind of limited in terms of their democratic space, or where democracy is constantly changing. It would be very good, because most of us are in Finland, to have some kind of Finnish perspective. So do you think, or have you witnessed any ways where the pandemic has had an impact on democracy in Finland?
Yes, well, thank you, and greetings from the Parliament. And in fact, the crisis has obviously infected our way of working as well, and obviously this has some reasons to talk about how it affects our democracy as well here in Finland. The main message is, however, that democracy was facing a lot of challenges around the world already before the crisis. This was the case in all countries. I'd say there's a lot of phenomena in this time that creates challenges like hate speech and spreading of false information, and social media. It can be a good thing, but it can obviously be a bad thing for democracy as well. And now the COVID crisis has brought a new situation in many countries, and of course also in Finland. During the springtime, we did have some challenges with information. The government was struggling with giving the information that politicians and the media would need in a democratic system. And this is a discussion that we have to have, the aftermath that we have to have. This cannot be the case during a crisis. Another challenge was the schedules during the crisis when it came. We were forced to make quite big decisions, big legislations in a limited time frame with limited access to information. And this is obviously a challenge for any democracy.
Thanks, Sarah, Sophia. The access to information, I think, is critical, because we see a lot of things being circulated. I know from the country where I come in the UK, things being circulated about the National Health Service, where I think it's vital that information is correct. I'm going to move to Yuri, and I want to ask Yuri a specific question in terms of age. Now, one of the defining messages of the pandemic has been that older people are much more affected. However, I saw in the press, I think yesterday in the UK, that senior political leadership in the UK was blaming young people for the spread of COVID. So how do you think COVID has affected the political participation of young people specifically?
Thank you, Razi, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'll mention first briefly about what I'm doing as a UN Youth Delegate. So my role as a UN Youth Delegate is to represent the Finnish young people at the United Nations as a part of the Finnish national delegations. And last February, I participated in this kind of a delegation in the Commission for Social Development in New York. And this autumn, I'll be taking part also in the General Assembly distantly. unfortunately distantly. And another part of my role is to actively engage with the young people in Finland in order to make the UN more accessible and perhaps interesting to them. Now, regarding the question about political participation of youth, I think that in Finland, at first in the springtime, the great deal of the political participation, it happened already through youth organizations, and all of these activities when the coronavirus started, it all stopped. But actually, I think the youth organizations have been able to quite well adapt to and continue their work also distantly. And it's important that through Zoom and through all these distant measures, it has even been more accessible to some young people, especially those who have been living in remote areas. So I think it has been it's a good opportunity to also reach out to young people. But on the other hand, many issues that interest the young people, for instance, climate activism, which has been very big, have been completely put to a halt because COVID-19 has understandably been dominating the agenda. But when we look at the impacts on the young people, for instance, in Finland, and I think this applies to many other countries as well, statistics show that 70% of the young people have experienced anxiety during the corona crisis, and this is including myself, for instance. And many young people have lost their summer jobs, especially considering that many work in the service and tourism sector, which has been severely hit. Those who have had difficulties with studies, for instance, are having even more of them as they are not getting enough support distantly. And social activities have been very important to the youth, and most of them have been cancelled. What also worries me the most from the statistics is that among those who are anxious or experiencing problems, up to 13% have had suicidal thoughts. So it's not very optimistic, unfortunately. And what I'd like to underline, that all of these issues really affect political participation of youth, and also they require support. It's like young people are very active by themselves, but support from adults is also very crucial. And this support has become hard to get, as most things are done distantly. So sometimes I think it's being forgot that capacity building is very crucial. And because not all young people will be able to take action by themselves. And there is a risk that in the aftermath of this corona crisis, the funding for youth will be cut, and it might have very severe long-term consequences.
Yeah. Yuri, so this is actually not just about political participation. This is about participation of youth in kind of every sphere aspect of their lives. If you're experiencing anxiety, depression, and negativity, then this is going to manifest itself in many, many different ways. So, no, that's really worrying. I know from my own friends that I've spoken to, young people's lives have been put on hold. There was a debacle about the exams, when you were 16 or 18, and now there seems to be no clue about what they're doing this year in university. So it's a very, very tough time. So I think it's not just about political participation. This is about general kind of young people and their well-being more than anything else. Okay, so we are slightly running over time a little bit, but I'm going to try and speed things up. We're going to have a video from Sarah Lester. Sarah Lester she's had a very interesting career working all over the world in the democratic space. I think she is in New York, so she sent a video message just setting out some of the challenges and then laying the foundations for some of the opportunities that we're going to discuss in the second half. So Matt-Lena, if you want to put Sarah's video up, great, thank you. I'll go on mute.
Hello, my name is Sarah Lister and I'm the Head of Governance at UNDP. Thanks for inviting me to share with you some of the ways in which UNDP is working to support democratic governance around the world. To begin with, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the particular circumstances we find ourselves in this International Day of Democracy. COVID-19 is disrupting and transforming governance by putting severe strain on governance systems, state-society relations, and in some places threatening human rights. Indeed, in some places we see the centralization of executive powers, increased pressures on socio-political cohesion, disruption of democratic practices, including elections, lack of confidence between people and the state, erosion in the relationships between local and national governments, a shrinking of civic space, the spread of mis- and disinformation, and indeed a lack of access to information. The pandemic and the disruptions and uncertainty it brings also presents many opportunities for corrupt actors to take advantage of the crisis, particularly in countries with weak institutions. All of this is certainly very concerning. On the other hand, COVID-19 also presents an unprecedented opportunity to make societies more inclusive and resilient, and in our responses, support fundamental principles of democratic governance, including accountability, transparency, and participation. Governance is central to UNDP's broader COVID-19 response in order to ensure plans and strategies that are inclusive, respect human rights, and are in accordance with the rule of law. This takes shape in different ways in different places, but, for example, UNDP works with other parts of the UN system to support the safe and orderly conduct of elections around the world. At the moment, we are assisting with assessments of the impacts of COVID-19 on electoral processes, as well as the development of new protocols where necessary. These may, for instance, facilitate the procurement of sensitive equipment, train polling staff under conditions of social distancing, or sensitize the general public on how to vote in a safe way and reassure them that it is safe to vote. We also provide technical assistance and advice in instances where the national authorities decide to postpone elections. We also seek to strengthen parliamentary oversight of COVID-19 response efforts, ensure the participation of civil society, and seek to mainstream anti-corruption measures into COVID responses, whether that relates to procurement of health equipment or the rolling out of large-scale social protection measures. Here, the aim is to support transparency and accountability, to reinforce public confidence and trust in oversight institutions, and ensure broad-based participation. With these objectives in mind, we are also intensifying our efforts, along with our partners, to prevent and mitigate the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. Countering inflammatory and discriminatory narratives in the public sphere, in traditional as well as social media, is critical. Addressing this information pollution, particularly in global and national pandemic responses, as well as in relation to elections, is a priority for UNDP. For UNDP, democratic governance means promoting equal voice and inclusive representation in all aspects of our work. We see fulfilling these principles as preconditions for the realization of human rights and a foundation for truly inclusive and sustainable development, even in times of pandemic. Thank you for your attention, and happy International Day of Democracy.
Thank you, Madlena. And please thank Sarah for taking the time to give us that message and to make the video. One thing that I will say from the UN side is that we have all been asked to step up in terms of our response. So the World Health Organization leads on the health response. OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, leads on the humanitarian response that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And UNDP leads on the socio-economic recovery and Build Back Better. So we are all supporting, working better together. And Itonde, you talked about a collective response, and that's something that we're all working. And this is one example of the UN coming together, but also with parliamentarians, with people like you and youth delegates and civil society, to try and see how we can collectively respond. I'm gonna go. We've got two questions, and then we've got the poll question. So for this second half, I'm just going to ask you just to keep questions a bit shorter. So your responses a little bit shorter, just for about a minute, so we can finish on time. The first question is to Maria, and then I'm going to go to Anu. But for Maria, you alluded to some of the responses that you are working on, and I know that we've discussed some digital responses on COVID. but if you could just share some examples of how UNDP has worked or adapted its work to the pandemic, and share any lessons that you might want to communicate to this group.
Thank you, Razi. Yes, I mean, we've been working virtually from day one of the pandemic, and luckily we've been able to do so very quickly. Together with the UN Kosovo team, we actually, one of the first things we did was conduct a rapid socioeconomic impact assessment to really understand the impact of the crisis on the lives of people and businesses, and that to be able to better target the response and to support these people and businesses. This was used for developing the socioeconomic response plan, which we have done together as the UN Kosovo team. And as you mentioned, we've been the technical lead in that. Overall, in all of our work, we've continued with, particularly when it comes to democratic governance, which is at the core of everything we do. We have continued, we've gone digital wherever possible. Activities that were supposed to be physical, have gone virtual. Maybe as an example, we've been continuing and intensifying our efforts in the area of anti-corruption, which is a key priority area for us, particularly knowing that corruption often flourishes at the time of uncertainty, and knowing also that there are criminals waiting to take advantage of the kind of weaknesses in the response to the pandemic. We've been working very closely with the anti-corruption authorities, really making sure that they are at the state of hyper alertness and that they have the tools to effectively detect and punish fraud and corruption related to the COVID response. We've helped them in developing an online database for intelligence-based investigations of corruption, organized crime, and financial crime. We've organized virtual trainings. And really, I think that what our cooperation with the anti-corruption officials show that, when you act quickly and provide them with the tools and support that they need to kind of resume their work or continue their work, this has really resulted in a quite rapid shift in the work culture. We've provided virtual tools to the parliament. We've provided tools to the employment agency so that they can continue with working. I would have many more examples to share, but I know time is limited. So maybe just one key summary is that we've really seen how important it is to be promoting the digital solutions, and not just the solutions, but really a new way of working, which again really is also key to ensuring the transparency, the accountability, and also the sharing of reliable information. The same way as elsewhere, there's been a lot of disinformation, misinformation, and through portals, through social media, and this is definitely something that we're all fighting together against as the UN family.
No, absolutely, and I'm going to ask Anu a question about that kind of misinformation. But the very fact that we are helping public goods and services to operate in the digital space and to make sure that the societal goods and societal benefits continue to be distributed and shared in the digital space, I think that's crucial. So Maria, thank you very much for that. That's very kind of inspiring what you're doing. Anu, a very quick question, and this is something that we've been working on. We've seen a lot of online hate speech, deep fakes, people being targeted specifically. So there's a question about countering harmful speech, while at the same time protecting freedom of expression. So the question is, how can we fight the spread of misinformation while respecting democratic principles?
Well, thank you, Razi. That is a really key issue, and indeed disinformation we've also seen in Finland related to also on the prevalence as well as the characteristics of COVID virus. I think one key issue is to look at the legislation of each country. Are they up to date? And then, of course, implementation. Also, an interesting point in that sense is, for instance, electoral violence. Do the electoral violence include hate speech, actions against hate speech, or necessary punishment methods? So that's one thing. But I would really draw attention on the supposed self-regulation of the big companies of social media. I know Sarah mentions traditional media as well, very important, but we see prevalence of hate speech being very important when we look at the Myanmar situation and what happened in Rakhine at the moment in Ethiopia and towards ethnic minorities. Many of these companies, such as Facebook, they don't even have local language knowledge or information on that. So really self-regulation, time of that, thinking that that's the key, is over. We need stronger methods from the national legislation. Media literacy, civic education. I wish we will see more of those, investment on those kind of actions in all the countries, including Finland, but also elsewhere where you already have problems of literacy to start with, but we shouldn't still be disillusioned or indifferent about it. But generally, I think support for independent media and holistic approaches on COVID. I'm very happy to hear, Maria, about all the things you've been doing in Kosovo. I think this is really important, not to purely focus on health, emergency activities, also on economic recovery, but also democratic governance and support the civil society. So I think we really need to keep in mind the holistic nature of the pandemic and tailor-make the packages, including all these three focuses. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anu. This touches on a point that really concerns me, which is about, you know, we've got ills and bads in our society on this planet. If we transmit those to the digital world, we collectively have failed. We have an opportunity to make the digital world a better place, and the fact that, you know, we're all working towards that, and the fact that COVID has pushed us all into the digital space means that it's urgent. It's more urgent than ever that space is protected. And, you know, we've talked about human rights and democracy and peace building. So that's very, very important for all of us. We're gonna go to the next poll question. So the second poll question, Magdalena, if you just put it up, I will just talk about it as it's up. So this is a question about elections, and we know that in many countries with weak democracies, elections have been postponed, and we have a total, actually globally, there's 111 election events have been postponed due to the pandemic. So the question is, remote voting, can this be a solution to hold fair and democratic elections during the pandemic? Either agree or disagree. There are lots of issues about remote voting, particularly around identity, but it's a very good idea in terms of just allowing that democratic space to function. So I'll read out the results. So this is interesting, actually. So 71% agree that remote voting can be a solution, 29% disagree. So not a huge majority like the last poll question, but it's good to see that. One of our challenges, I think, is that it's, you know, remote voting is one way, but there's lots of other ways I think we need to explore and actually make sure when we explore them to shore them up so they're kind of watertight. So I'm going to go to Itonde. So Itonde, this is your last question. Just in terms of the impact of the pandemic, we know that it has exacerbated some of the inequalities in society. But it also presents an opportunity to rebuild the social contract between government and citizens. So this comes back to what Maria was saying about kind of sentiment analysis. How can we ensure that societies come out of this crisis stronger? And perhaps the focus for the answer is from your work.
Gosh, Rosie, this is an essential question. And in light of the conversation, I would point to 4 points of emphasis which have come up. 1, leadership. 2, systems. 3, communication, and 4, trust. Briefly, the interrelation between the 4. Leadership, as you put it, Razi, has been a fundamental question in terms of how societies have been able to deal with this crisis, particularly in fragile states. But leadership void of systems to deliver is hollow. So that leadership, yes, but tied to systems, equally so. Systems without clear channels and consistent means of communicating across society, regardless of class, the systems will not deliver on their objectives without clear communication. And here, communication without a receptive audience, that is a society that is able to underline it, trust what is being said, means that all of the above will falter. And particularly for the reasons you raised, in an era of great doubt, all of the questions above concerning leadership, concerning systems, concerning communication, and the very basis of shared facts, emphasis around trust. We use the language of trust building, but this too relates to how societies might come out of this pandemic much stronger in tying these linkages. So not isolating leadership from systems, from communication, from trust. And living and residing in Finland, trust, with all due respect and humility, has been a fundamental aspect, and I would appreciate hearing Sara Sofia's opinion on this, to the ability for Finland to deliver. That is, there's a trust in leadership, in systems, in what is being said, and thus the response has been profound comparatively. Thank you, Razi.
No, absolutely. I'm not really supposed to fly the Finnish flag. I fly all of the member states' flags, but the trust levels here, I've been blown away by. Quite frankly, it's phenomenal. Leadership systems, communications, and trust are vital if there's going to be another pandemic or another crisis. So this is about shoring them up now to respond, but in the future, making sure that these things are strong and robust, that we are more resilient to future crises. Sara Sofia, I'm going to come to you for the next question, and then it's Yuri, and then it's our last poll. So just we talked about Finland. We love living here, obviously, and I want to get from you some of the concrete actions that Finland and the Finnish Parliament or the parties are taking to strengthen democracy both during and after the pandemic.
Yes, well, obviously, trust is very important. Cooperation is very important. Finland has over 100 years of history as a multi-party democracy, and we have a very strong tradition in bringing up agreements also at difficult situations. So now it's important that we ensure this trust also in the future. Also in a situation of crisis that we faced, and we should really have an open discussion now about the vulnerability of our democratic system, our legislation that we have. We can now see that we had challenges in our legislation when it comes to a crisis situation. It was not planned for that, and we need to be prepared. We need to make sure that we have a strong democracy in also at the time of a crisis. So an open discussion about the mistakes that we had, the challenges that we had this year during this pandemic. Obviously, democracy will never be finished. It's a process, and we always need to be ready to develop and create new ways of people to be able to participate and have their voice being heard. And this is something that Finland could once again lead the way. I'm quite interested in the possibilities that we have, for example, in deliberation using, for example, different panels or forums of people bringing up different perspectives. For example, what I did an initiative about last term was how these polls of people could be used in the process of having citizens' initiative in the parliament. So we have digital tools, we have new ways that we really need to find as tools to make our democracy even stronger and better.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, Sophia, it's an interesting proposal because you're using the move to an online world to promote participation. So if you are, trying to energize citizens in democracy or in processes, and Finland is actually quite a big country, and there's lots of people who live remotely in Finland. So their ability to kind of participate and engage through the digital is actually is very positive. I'm just going to come to Yuri, and then we're going to take the last poll. Yuri, in terms of, you mentioned it before, young people have been engaged, particularly through the climate action and Fridays for the Future. But I was just wondering, there's a question around political apathy. What sort of actions do we need to take? And I think Sarah Sophias has alluded to some of those to ensure that young people participate in democratic processes.
Yes, thank you. Well, I don't completely agree with the political apathy. I think it's quite a divided question. What are we talking about? Young people are very interested, like we said, about climate, for instance, racism, human rights, LGBT plus rights, and very willing to participate. But it's more like in campaigns and activism right now. On the other hand, like former political institutions and traditional party politics are becoming like more distant and less interesting. And this is the question, I think, how to bridge the gap, how to translate that work into results and responses. And I have 3 points here that I think needs to be done to reduce political apathy. First is that reducing socioeconomic inequalities should be the first priority, because that's the underlying reason. A part of youth is getting very active, and the other part, which is not getting active at all. And we can see that there are more inequalities. So I think this is a very underlying cause that needs to be addressed. Second, ensure more space and places for the youth in the formal decision-making tables and give the necessary support to them. Because in this way, activism, which is outside the door, can be translated into action. And a good example is, for example, right now we have a youth climate delegate who has a place in the Finnish government's round table for climate. So then we need more places in the decision-making tables. And number 3 is that we need to translate politics into a language that is interesting and understandable to people. I've been studying questions about the EU, or right now working with the issues of UN, and I have been surprised how relatively little effort is being put into this. Like there is a big problem, for instance, in the big institutions, especially the international ones. There are not so many interesting people who we would know from these institutions that we could relate to, who would be a good representative or a face. And I think that's an issue which could make it more interesting and people would participate.
Thanks, Yuri. I couldn't agree with you more on your last point. I'm constantly being chastised for using terminology that's, a very select few understand. But thank you for reminding us. Your 3 messages are actually pertinent for all of the participants here, and I'm sure the majority of the audience. So thank you for those. We're just out of time, so I'm going to take the last poll question. I'm going to apologise because we haven't had the time to discuss the poll questions, but the poll questions are things that we take away because it's our own sentiment analysis that we're doing here. So it is still very useful. Sorry, Sophia, I know you need to leave. So if you can happily leave, that's fine. Thank you for your participation, but we'll take the last poll and I'll share the results. So can we emerge from this crisis more resilient and move towards achieving SDG 16, peace, justice and strong institutions? I would slightly change that question. Can we achieve all of the SDGs, come out of this crisis? Because they're all pertinent, not only peace, justice, but I suppose for the Day of Democracy. So agree or disagree on this question. Can we emerge from this crisis more resilient and move towards achieving all of the SDGs? You can agree. Actually, I can also participate. Yeah. And the response is 78%. So that's so I think most of the audience, 78% of the audience, are definitely glasses half full. I think we are optimistic. I think the messages that we've heard today give me a great deal of optimism, but they also give me some of the areas that have been spoken about, particularly from Yuri and Anu, in terms of the direction, in terms of what we should be doing, are also very important and also very inspiring. So thank you very much for that. To all the panel members, thank you so much. There's two thank yous that I need to do before you go. Very quickly, Helena and her team from UN Association, thanks so much for helping to organize this. Matt Lehner and Alexei from UNDP have worked very, very hard to make this happen and to get everyone together and the questions. So without them and without UNDP, this simply would not have happened. Thank you, Matt Lehner, thank you, Alexei, and thank you, UNDP. Wishing you a very happy rest of the week and the best of luck for all of your work.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.